Hello, everyone. Welcome to Organic World Building Live Q&A for Week 7. All right, let's jump into it. So it's been great to see people's scenes starting to come together, seeing all the assets really being created, and kind of getting to that point where most of you have the majority of the assets you want to have for your scenes. Now, of course, there are still going to be some instances and elements where you want to kind of create some more assets, or you want to kind of polish them up. And so, of course, we do still have 3 more weeks here to kind of finalize everything. That does mean, though, that we only have 3 weeks left to kind of just fully build out the environment. But you'll start to notice once you do have a lot of your assets kind of created, helping populate these spaces becomes a lot quicker and a lot faster. Environments are the one piece of art that has the largest kind of amount of lead time before you see it into its kind of full formed phase where you kind of actually see everything. Like a single prop asset can just take maybe a few days to make, maybe even a few hours, and you're like, cool, I've got the asset, I've got everything I want. But environments can take weeks, months, even like a year or two to kind of fully make and fully build out. So that's why they are, pretty difficult just from that sense, because they are very easy for a lot of people to be kind of like, oh, I've been working on the scene for a few weeks. I get bored and I kind of like jump off and then go on to something else, or they get inspired to do a new environment. So glad to see everyone kind of really sticking up with the work, and the culmination of all these assets you're making, all these things that you're going to be learning are going to help build and funnel into your final project, which, coming up in week 10, we'll be able to see. And, that's going to be really great. So hopefully everyone can kind of still keep up with the work. I know that in week 8, they posted about the kind of like certificates. Ken, one of the moderators, posted about that. I guess you have to have like 80% of your stuff turned in. So make sure you don't fall behind on these last 3 weeks if you are trying to get one of these certificates. I have no control over them at all. If you ask like, oh, can I do with this or whatever, like, unfortunately, I can't give out any of the certificates. So I just figured I would mention that, as I always have at least 1 or 2 students who kind of just maybe trails off at the very end of the class, and they kind of miss a bunch of their assignments at the end. They're always asking to, for the certificate. And unfortunately, I just can't give them out. But I just wanted to make sure I mention that, as it has come up before in the past. Right. So also with this week, I just figured I would mention it since it is that time of year. But it is the week of GDC, the Game Developers Conference, which is always really fun and really cool to kind of see. There's always a ton of new tech, new games to kind of check out, new things that different studios are pushing, or different talks that people are giving. Those talks are always really great. I know you have to pay for them, like to watch them now, but generally, some bits and pieces of them will always kind of find their way online or on YouTube in, kind of the coming weeks and months. So some of them are always kind of really cool to check out. A lot of the talks are really great. So if you can ever watch any of those talks, definitely give them a listen, as I always find them to have great bits of nuggets of information. I usually will kind of just put one on in the background while I'm working on something and just kind of like passively listen to the information there. Also with GDC comes just a whole bunch of new cool tech videos and things like that. If you haven't checked it out, you will definitely want to check out Quixel's Rebirth UE4 video. It was really fantastic. It's this kind of like photorealistic with a bunch of like mega scans and Houdini stuff that made this, basically this really beautiful cinematic here. So I would definitely give it a watch. They have, some beautiful environment art that's created in here, all of course using kind of scanned assets or scanned textures to kind of really make the scene. So it's kind of showing you what is really possible with, pure photorealism in an environment. And so, it's just a really cool thing. And they just have a lot of really great shots in there. So definitely cool to check out and see what kind of some studios or some places are going to be kind of pushing for in the future with kind of photorealism. Now, the one caveat to that is, of course, that not every studio is going to be using photorealism and things like megascans. However, there are some studios that are heavily adopting it. One example is like Battlefield and Battlefront from DICE. Pretty much everything they have there is a scanned asset. The only things that are not are things that they have to model uniquely, but for their environments, pretty much all the rocks and things like that are made are scanned. Their terrain is scanned. They're using actual real world scan data for that kind of stuff. So it is kind of an interesting way to kind of build environments and worlds. The artists there are primarily then kind of world designers for games like Battlefront and Battlefield, and they're no longer really creating assets. They're taking scan data and cleaning that scan data up and then being able to kind of place their assets around the world to kind of build out these spaces. So it's definitely a different way to work. I know we're obviously going with the approach of kind of you modeling and texturing all your assets for the most part, and kind of creating and building a world. That is still very much the most common way environments are kind of created. But of course, I do want to mention that scan stuff is becoming very popular. And I, of course, believe a lot of indie studios will leverage scan data in the coming years to kind of really build hyper-realistic worlds for very cheap. Once, there are enough companies kind of going out there scanning a whole bunch of things like, Quixel, Megascan stuff. So definitely check out all the stuff that's going on at GDC. It is always really cool. Also, since GDC is kind of this topic right now, I figured I would mention just some good pointers. If you do ever get the chance to go out to kind of a large convention like GDC or, anything else where there are going to be some kind of game developers in there, since, it's a question I get asked often, like, even on ArtStation, I'll get messages of people asking like, oh, what should I do for my portfolio and everything. So we'll definitely get into that a ton in week 10, but just in case any of you are there or you're interested, one of the best things you can do is make sure you have your portfolio up on an ArtStation page, or on a personal website if you have it, and have it easily accessible. Don't print things out. For some reason, I still get a lot of people asking me if they should print out their portfolios. Definitely don't do that. You just, ideally, if you have a tablet, take that with you. If not, bring a laptop or something you can show off. Worst case scenario, you can show things off on a phone. But phones are really kind of small and the screen isn't that big. They're great if you just kind of randomly meet someone. You're like, hey, can you check out my work? You can easily show them there. But having your stuff on a kind of nice tablet, able to easily show it off is always, kind of a really good process. So if you do ever get to kind of any one of those meetings, kind of go there with an open mind, try to meet up with as many kind of recruiters as possible that are there. They might not have the artistic background that you are really hoping for, but they're always going to have a lot of great information on what you can kind of expect, because they're going to be the first ones to see your portfolio when it gets submitted to a company. They're essentially the first line of defense before they then will look at it and be like, oh no, this person doesn't hit the qualifications that we need. We're not going to send it to kind of our leads and so forth. So, getting feedback from them, even if they are not in an art position and they are just kind of in a recruiter, they are really beneficial for that, because they're going to give you a lot of really good information on what will kind of come across well on a portfolio. So utilize them as well. And then if you do get a portfolio review ever from someone at an event like GDC, one of the biggest things to make sure you try not to do, which I've definitely seen a lot, is when you are being given feedback by someone, even if you disagree with it, for some reason, apparently, I guess a lot of people find it very difficult to not tell the person giving them a review in person, no, that's not why I was doing it. I was doing it for this. They're just going to give you their thoughts and their feelings on it. And even if you're like, oh, okay, cool. Yeah, no, I totally wasn't doing that. That wasn't what I was going for. Just keep that to yourself. Fix things if you want to on your end, but just kind of listen to whatever feedback they are giving you. Kind of take that into consideration, that someone just randomly seeing your stuff, randomly seeing your portfolio, is kind of getting this impression from your work. And their opinion might be wrong on what you're trying to do for your environment, but definitely don't kind of like essentially fight their opinion on what is going on. For some reason, anytime I've given a portfolio critique or review online, people are always kind of cool with it. But then for some reason, when you kind of are doing it in person, I guess people feel like they have to kind of talk back with you or try to make some kind of conversation out of the review process and kind of be like, oh no, I was doing it for this reason. Generally, it never comes off well. So try to avoid that, as that can seem like kind of a rookie mistake. All right, so we didn't really have many questions for the Q&A, and then most of these kind of questions that we had here were pretty self-explanatory, and I went ahead and answered them. So if there's any questions, of course, that any of you have, or if you're kind of wondering about them, like Frank was asking about LODs for trees, I can just kind of quickly go over this real quick. So he was wondering about kind of what we're doing for the furthest LODs for trees. I know this is more of a technical question and not necessarily something that you might need to know for kind of the scenes you're building right now. But there's pretty much like two techniques we have for LODs when it comes to trees, or at least two that we use for stuff like on Uncharted and The Last of Us. And the two different ones are called billboards and then flip books. So a billboard is basically just a texture of a tree. So if you can imagine, if you like took one of these trees, basically just rendered it out kind of either in Maya, in Max, or even in Unreal, basically just kind of like took a screenshot of it, like of this tree, pasted it on a texture, and then you create a shader that essentially will always face the camera. So no matter where you rotate around the camera, wherever you are as a player, that tree will always face you. The illusion could definitely fall apart if you get above the tree and look down, because that card is always going to be pointing directly like a 90-degree angle right at the camera. But if you can ever kind of get around the tree and you can just kind of like you're on a ground level or they're way up high here, they can be really cheap and really effective to create the look of a lot of trees in the background. Because we start to see some of these trees back here, here in the background, you can't really see how much modeling detail they have. And, you don't need all the dense polygons that are in there when they're this far away. So having just a card with a texture on it can kind of really help out the performance when you are kind of getting into an optimization phase. And again, it's basically just like if you took a screenshot of your tree and used that as kind of your texture. So we do that all the time. Let me see if I have any examples of that. And ArtStation's pretty slow, I guess maybe because everyone's showing portfolios at GDC. And then, of course, the other method is called a flip book, which is essentially it's very much like the kind of camera-facing cards. However, instead of just having one screenshot of a texture, you're taking probably around maybe 6 or 7 different views of the tree, and you're kind of capturing those images kind of from all different angles, even a top angle, and then it essentially will adjust the whatever texture is being displayed every time you rotate the camera around. So if you rotate a camera around the flip book kind of billboard card, then you're going to get just like the top version of the tree to show up. If you kind of drop down below and you're seeing it from the side, then you'll get kind of a side view. And then if you start to rotate around the tree, it'll eventually switch to one of the other sides you've captured. So again, kind of a technical optimization thing that really kind of is dependent on whatever engine and how much you're using it. Especially that flipbook stuff is really expensive comparatively to like just a camera-facing billboard card. But I thought I would just mention it as, I know a lot of people are always kind of interested in some of those things and how you can kind of go about doing that. And then Lewis asked about, he was wondering if we ever have kind of meetings about work, about creating assets and environments that reflect the story of the game. For something like The Last of Us, you can tell a lot of detail went into telling the stories through the environment via placement of assets, and that really helps add to a lot of the environmental depth. So yes, this is something that we do extremely frequently. Not only do we have meetings about it, we even have designers whose entire job is basically to be creating some extra little stories and writing for those kind of character and story moments that go throughout the game. That isn't to say that as the environment artist, you're not making these little stories, because for the most part you are. For any environment that you're building, you're going to be needing to kind of create these spaces and add in these little stories. But one thing, some of the designers we have at work, they are kind of being like, okay, well, we're going to go through this series of levels and we want to kind of string a story from one level to the next and have little elements in there that kind of help tell this larger little mini story. So to give an example, in the first Last of Us game, there is this one area where you're kind of on a little shoreline and you come across this boat and you find out the boat belongs to this guy named Isaac, who was this boat captain who eventually crashed there. And then as you progress further into the level and further into like the next section of the level, you found out that he kind of ran across these like orphan kids and orphan families, how they built this little housing area underneath and in the sewers, how they had special rules to make sure that the infected couldn't get in, eventually until some of the infected got in, killed a bunch of people. Really sad, and you're like, this is terrible. But it was adding this cool little through line throughout this kind of story. Later on in the game, you get to another section where you find out some more information about Isaac, where it's before he ever went on his little boat journey to try and escape some infected. So we told more stories kind of further on in the game, kind of hearkening back to those little moments and stories. And so we tried to include a lot of things that kind of related to him being a boat captain and all of this and trying to escape from the infected in the first place, which would then he eventually kind of crash landed and then found that little group of younger kids, younger people that he tried to build a little settlement for. So we do things like that quite often. It's really what's important about building environments that are believable and very interesting. It can be a little bit easier to just build an environment that looks really pretty and you're like, oh, look, it's got, a lot of just grass all over the place, or it's, got some beautiful vistas. But being able to tell a story in your environment is really what's going to help it stand above the rest. It's going to make it it's going to make it kind of more engaging when you feel like you are kind of diving into the story, like what's going on there, like what's happening. So even for just like a little example here, for this like little ice pond that I have here in this scene. So an easy way to start telling a story with this, even more so than just like, oh, cool, there's whatever, like an ice pond. If you do something even as simple, because again, this is how simple adding story can be. If like I added a little circular cutout hole in the ice, maybe, like a little bit of a fishing equipment, or not even that, maybe just even that little kind of cutout hole in the ice, it's already going to start to read like, oh, this was somewhere people were ice fishing. So you're already kind of telling a story, you're helping bring character to the environment. And all you had to really do was kind of like cut a hole in this ice to kind of give the feeling that like, oh, hey, there's something cool happening here. There's something interesting that, people have interacted with this environment. They're kind of telling these stories. So yeah, we definitely have a lot of talks and meetings about kind of environments that help reflect the game. I think one of the ones that a lot of people really resonated well with in the first Last of Us is that there's this one scene there's one little area that you're kind of crawling through this like broken hotel or apartment building and everything. And you crawl underneath this one rotted out kind of wooden wall. And on the other side, you see this bathtub and these two people in it, and they're dead. It's been definitely a long time. They're just basically skeletons at this point, and the water's filled up with all this muck and just grossness. But when you look a little closer, you notice that there is a toaster in there, and the toaster has been plugged into the wall. And it's pretty obvious that these people that were living here, killed themselves to kind of kill themselves so they didn't turn into these kind of zombie infected creatures. They kind of took that way out instead of, succumbing to something kind of murdering them and killing them. And so things like that, they're really simple, but they can leave a really big impact on a lot of people. So those are kind of like the little story moments. Again, those are kind of like the points of interest I was trying to stress to you all about kind of creating for your environments. Again, they don't have to be big. They don't need to be grandiose temples to be kind of interesting. They can be really small, cool little elements of a story that kind of just help you understand what's going on in this world and what is interesting. If you're just kind of placing grass and flowers and rocks and trees, that's going to be a really nice base for something, but you want to be able to tell a story and how people interacted with it. It can range from, just a ton of different things. So that's why using a lot of reference image, kind of figuring out what the story is you want to tell in your environment, kind of even just kind of trying to establish those timelines, what the time frame is that we kind of discussed all the way in week 1 are always really important and helpful because they can lend well to helping you tell what kind of story you want to, helping you kind of figure out okay, what can I have here? And, again, even small little things like that, small little stories can be very interesting and give you a lot of weight to any of these environments you're building. All right. So for next week, we're going to be going over water and some river stuff and kind of just building out our environments, fleshing things out a little more. And so in week 8, I go over kind of this river tool that I think works really well if you want to be able to create a pretty easy river, and it has a lot of options. So I kind of go over that as I find it to be a really great tool. However, it of course is $15, and I know not everyone wants to spend any more money on anything. So I just wanted to show that there are some other options if you are kind of not wanting to purchase any kind of river tools or anything like that. So just in the Unreal Epic Games kind of launcher, there is the Learn tab, which is a great tab. It's got a whole bunch of cool little kind of demos that you can download, things that you can kind of really check out, learn about. You can download essentially these entire scenes, check out how a bunch of these assets are made, figure out how they're kind of constructing their shaders, their models, their lighting, all these kind of things. And you can even add some of these elements to your scene. And one of the best ones is the water planes demo. So basically it just has, a bunch of different watery surfaces, and it has a bunch of shader parameters that you can kind of change around to add a bunch of really nice water to your scene. So I think it's a really great one to kind of check out. They also have a little video on it and everything. But basically, if you want to, you can kind of just download it, pull these little water planes into your scene, because oftentimes, you just want a nice static shot of some really good looking water. And you really don't need the river tool that I'll show off that has kind of a bunch of flow and buoyancy kind of stuff, because, maybe that's just what you would need for more like a full-on game. But the water planes thing is really great. And, I know they keep updating it all the time to make sure that it's kind of updated and usable, but it's a great thing. Definitely check out, because again, water is an extremely technical thing. And at most studios, you're probably going to be using, or you're going to have a technical artist or a programmer who's kind of setting up the majority of water, and you are kind of just using whatever they set up for, your engine. But that being said, there's a whole bunch of other really great things in here to kind of really check out. So yeah, definitely give it a look. If you're interested in any kind of particles, the particle effects little scene here is great to check out. It's got a lot of different things like snow and ice and some like fire stuff. It's of course it's with particles and all these things. There are things you're going to want to kind of save to the very end of your environment because you want to be able to make sure that your environment is working well kind of without these particles first. And I know it can be a tendency for people to just be like, oh, I'm just going to throw snow into my environment, have this like snowy effect going on. And then you can't really see the rest of your environment like this right now. Like if this was your environment, like the snow looks cool, but like this is just really distracting. You can't really see much of what else is going on in the environment. So it can be a bit difficult. But for some shots, if you want to have like kind of just, a third or fourth screenshot in your environment and show it off with kind of in a blizzard, this can be definitely a nice addition to your scene. So the particle effects is also a really good one to check out, just in case you want to kind of maybe add some particles. But that is something that I would suggest leaving to kind of week like 10, week 9, when you're kind of dialing things in. The other way to kind of get some really nice content is for water in kind of the most basic form is to kind of add the starter content to your scene. So you can just go to the add new button, add feature or content pack, and then you can go to content packs and then you can add the starter content. It'll bring in a ton of shaders and a ton of things you can look at. It can muddy up your scenes a bit. So oftentimes you can just kind of like either add this entire thing to your scene, or you can kind of just copy the water that's in there that is, again, really simple water, but it works really well if you're just going for some nice static screenshots. All right, now I wanted to show off a little demo that we can add some more variety of color to any of our assets, and predominantly kind of like our foliage assets. So if we have a scene where we're painting a bunch of grass down on like a given terrain chunk, let's just grab some terrain here, set the density something really high. And let's say, we've got a big shot with a bunch of grass. It's kind of all over here. And we're like, okay, let's see. Let's change that angle so we get a little bit more in there. All right, so we just got like a whole bunch of grass in here. And we're like, cool, got a bunch of grass, but, we're noticing that everything is just all green. It's just kind of like, okay, that's just a whole bunch of green. It's all the same. It's got no kind of color variation. And we want some nice kind of color variation in our scene. So we're not just seeing kind of the same thing over and over again. What we can do is we can kind of create a overall texture that will really help out. And essentially, it's going to be a texture that is kind of like a top-down view of our ground here. And we'll be able to paint in different areas where we want to kind of essentially tint this grass different colors. Now, I'm going to use super exaggerated colors, as that's always the easiest way to kind of test out a lot of these demos. And this grass is doing this weird lotting, so I'm not sure what that's about. I don't know if you can see that, but it's creating this big square there. Very strange. Either way, we'll create it with some really bright, ridiculous, obnoxious colors, but hopefully it should give you a good sense of kind of what you can do, because I know showing off subtle colors on the live stream doesn't really come through that well. So we'll do, super crazy, obnoxious colors. And then, of course, for your own scenes, you can kind of paint in, more subtle color variation and breakups. Now, the one thing to note is that this is a technique that you might want to kind of save towards the end, because if you are still changing up and building a lot of your environment, you might have to kind of adjust this texture map quite often if you do it too early. Because remember, again, as I said, it's going to basically be a top-down texture of your environment, kind of just looking down. Now, if you want to take your environment and actually utilize what you have, you can kind of like be like, okay, I'm going to, just do a top-down view of my environment just to kind of get the size and understand where, like, okay, here's the river, here's some mountains. So you kind of know where a bunch of these landmarks are. And then you can kind of just, do a print screen to capture that. So you can start editing that and using that as kind of a base to paint on. But for this demo right now, we'll just kind of create our own little texture. So basically, obviously, we want to keep our texture square. So we'll just create a 2K texture right here. Now, the majority of the grass we're going to want to just be, nice dark emerald green, nothing too crazy. But for any kind of like details or patterns on there, we're going to want to just use something ridiculous again here, just to kind of really show this off. So we'll just make some ugly patterns here so you can kind of see. We'll have a nice big old chunk of red. We will get some blue in there, and we will also get a softer edge brush in here so we kind of feather this out. And that way we can kind of just get a different look of, kind of what this is going to be. We'll have the hard edge brush here, and then we'll have kind of more softer, a nicer kind of fall off in this area. And then, of course, we can just add in some white here. Add in a nice little smiley face. All right, so we have our texture, and we will just save this out. We'll put it here, and then we'll save this as a targa. And we'll just call it, let's see. We'll call it macro color variation. Now we'll just jump back into Unreal. We'll import our texture. I will just import it here for ease of use. All right, there we go. We've got our nice little smiley face texture. So now we're going to be wanting to create a material for this. Now, the one thing to note is, although essentially this texture here is basically mapped to what our landscape is. So again, we kind of like, you can imagine if you needed to take a top-down view, you're not going to be assigning this texture to a material that will be placed on your landscape. You're going to be applying this texture or this material essentially to the grass or to any object that you're going to be using. So that is the one thing to kind of remember, is that this, although this texture is kind of essentially going to be mapped to our landscape, we're going to be placing it in, we're going to be placing the shader on the grass asset or whatever object we want to add this variation to. So we'll just create a new kind of grass material. Let's call this grass macro. You can actually we can just easily add it into our grass right here. Actually, probably don't want to do that. It might be a little messy with all this stuff, just to make it kind of simple for everyone. So we'll just grab our textures, just set up this grass real quick. Grab our foliage. Throw in our roughness there. Our normal map. We'll change our blend mode to a masked. Put in our opacity mask. And then we just basically have some nice little grass right there. Just click apply. Now we're going to want to assign this to our grass here, of course. So we'll grab our grass mesh that we're using. Believe it's this one. And we'll create a material instance, as that is always the best way to do things. Move it there. Now we can assign our new material to our grass as applied all over. All right, so we can see that now we have our kind of grass on there. Again, nothing crazy. It's just basically the base color, a roughness, and a normal map. You know, the simplest thing you could probably do. You could of course obviously add it into your macro grass here, you know, with, you know, your subsurface scattering color, your wind, kind of any of these other kind of elements that you might have in your shader setup. But just to kind of keep it as simple as possible, we'll just do it this way. All right, so now with anything where we're essentially going to be blending, again, we're going to want to use our good friend linear interpolate, because we're going to be blending between this texture sample here, and we're going to be basically blending this grass texture with this kind of essentially like overlay mask. I think and like everyone has like kind of a different name for it. But essentially, we're just going to be using this as a nice kind of color overlay for our scene. So we'll grab a linear interpolate. Connect our grass up together. Now the alpha is going to be what we are going to be blending these two together with. And since we need to kind of create specific UVs for this texture, we'll do that kind of right now. So with this texture here that we essentially want to kind of map to this little piece of terrain, we need to basically map it perfectly to kind of like where the edges of this terrain are. And so to do that, we need to kind of find where in the world this landscape is so that we can kind of map these areas correctly. So to do that, and anytime you need to find like the world position of your object, you just want to use the absolute world position. And as always, even though it's called absolute world position, it doesn't show up if you search absolute world position. It just shows up if you search world position. Always, probably every time I'm always searching for it, I almost always just search absolute world position. And I'm like, oh, that's right. It's only under world position. So just in case you kind of are like, oh no, where is it? I can't find absolute world position. It's just the world position now. It's for some reason, I don't know why they've never changed it. It's pretty silly. Okay, so to find the absolute world position, how can we do that? Well, we can see here on our landscape that we have actual transform coordinates. We have an X, a Y, and a Z value. These are the location of where in the world this landscape is. It is like 29,000 X units over from the kind of 0, origin. It's negative 6,000 Y units and then 100 Z units up. Since we are mapping a 2D texture on this, we don't care about the Z channel at all. All we care about is basically our X and our Y. So we want to make sure that we are just grabbing the X and Y position of our absolute world position. Absolute world position will find out, is trying to find out the absolute world position in all three directions. But of course, since we only want and only need two of those, we can essentially just mask out the sections that we want. So we will just get a component mask, and it's already set up with RG, which is essentially in Unreal kind of speak. RGB is the same as XYZ. So if you're ever doing anything that needs location data, always remember that it's essentially in the same exact order. The R, G, and B values correspond to X, Y, and Z. So we can just kind of plug our absolute world position in here because we're just trying to get the X and Y position. Now we want to be able to actually use these values here to actually find out where it, or to actually essentially put these UVs. We're gonna like remove essentially the world position data to be able to locate this. So for that, we need a subtract because we need to subtract these coordinates, the X and the Y, from our world position. And for that, we can just use a constant 2 value. And so you can get that much like if you hit 1 on your keyboard, you get a single scalar parameter. If you hold 2, you get a 2 constant parameter. And then if you hold 3, you get the third one, which is where you can add and change color. But we only need the 2, and we don't need to make this like, we don't need to convert it to a parameter, as this value should never change. But this value is basically going to correspond to our X and our Y direction. So pretty much all you have to do is just come over here to the location, copy that location real quick, and the X will be our top number. We can just plug that in, and the Y will be our Y position, and then we can plug that in. Now, don't get too worried about this kind of weird number that is showing up on the top here. Unreal changes some of the values if it ever gets to kind of like a crazy number. So instead of putting 6,000, it basically puts 6, essentially exponent plus how many zeros it has after it. So it's like 6 plus 3 zeros, which would be the 6,000, or 2.97 exponent 4 zeros. So this one has like 4 digits after it. A little confusing, but just in case you see that, don't worry, it's not a bug. It's just trying to display this in a easy, simple way. You know, I know it threw me off the first time I ever saw it, and you know, it's just kind of a weird way that Unreal is kind of displaying this data. So I'll plug that in. Now, this next part, I've never really figured out how to exactly guess this next part, but essentially we need to kind of figure out the scale of how big this is. Now, the only problem is that on any kind of terrain you're making, the scale is always going to be at 100. It's going to, you know, always be 100. You never really want to change up the scale. But in units big, in terms of like how many units this is, it has an actual number. I don't know exactly how to figure out that number. So anytime I'm doing it, I always kind of just guess at this part, and then I adjust the number once we get the texture on there. And you'll kind of see what I mean. So basically what you have to do is you have to divide the scale of how many units this is by our location. And so I'll put in a scalar parameter for this, convert this to a parameter, and we'll just call this landscape size. And we'll put in just a nice default value of like 1,000 for right now. Now this will be our UVs for our texture sample here. Basically, we're trying to figure out and determine exactly how big the texture needs to be for this. We're taking our absolute world position. We're masking out just the red and blue, or the X and Y channel. We're getting our terrain's landscape coordinates. We are dividing that by our landscape size, how big and how many units big this terrain piece is. Again, I always kind of set in a scalar parameter, just kind of guessing at what it is. And then it's the easiest one to kind of adjust on the fly. And that will be plugged into our UVs. So again, we're going to be basically lerping between our texture sample of our grass and then this to kind of like go on top of it. Now for the alpha, we just need a very simple kind of texture coordinate in there. It just needs a texture coordinate that we just will leave at the default, because again, we're just kind of taking taking this texture and just kind of mapping it to this terrain, which is already a 1-to-1. So we don't need to kind of change these values here. We don't need to kind of create, our normal multiply with a scalar parameter, kind of connect these up. We don't need that at all because we are just using the 1-to-1 values here. But what we do have to do is we do have to convert those 1-to-1 values into just a single grid coordinate, either an X or a Y position. And of course, to do that, we just want to mask that out with our component mask. And so from what I've seen, you can pretty much choose either the R or the G channel, and it'll give you basically the exact same kind of results. So, you can kind of either choose one or the other. You just need to basically be limiting these texture coordinates to one channel. And this is going to help us give us our alpha. Now, if we want any extra control to kind of control the fall off for this, we can use our power node, a multiply node. Just grab a power node. This will just give us some nice kind of fall off on our mask here. If we want to kind of like either not have this effect showing or have it showing even more. So that we can use for another scalar parameter, convert this, and we'll call this landscape blend. And we'll plug this into our alpha, plug our lerp into our base color, and then we'll click apply. And then we'll wait for that to compile real quick, or hopefully quick. And then we can see we've got this texture kind of showing up here. Now, when we grab our instance right here, we can adjust these values to make sure that we kind of nail our texture to be exactly where we want it. So this is, again, why I mentioned that essentially the landscape size, that is kind of just a guess. You kind of have to kind of like guess to figure out exactly what it is. So generally you need a much bigger number to get it kind of closer to the 1-to-1. Actually, let me see if I can get this grass to show up a little bit better. It'll make it a little bit easier to view. I was erasing it. All right, so it's there, but it's fading out. So let's see if we can adjust fade out on this real quick. I'm not sure why it's fading out like that. It's a weird little bug. All right, well, I don't want to take up too much time trying to figure out why it's awkwardly fading out. We can still just proceed with the demo. It's just a shame as it shows off a little bit nicer when it has all the grass on there. Yeah, it's because it's all full of grass, so I'm not sure why it's kind of awkwardly fading out like that. Such a weird pattern. Anyways, so we can start to see our texture nicely coming in here, kind of showing off things. Maybe if we just flatten this down here. Set that. To a much lower angle. Yeah, it's still lotting really weird in some of those areas. So I'm not sure what that is. Must be some kind of bug. All right, there we go. It's at least a little bit better. Now we can see our nice little patch of red. We can see our smiley face, and we can see our blue area as well. And of course, you know, kind of when we adjust this value, we can see how we're getting it to show in kind of a different space. So if we set this number to like 75,000 or 750, yeah, 75,000, you know, it's kind of adjusting it. So this is why I mentioned kind of like, it's always the guessing one where you have to kind of guess exactly what the dimensions are of this. So one way to kind of easily check, since, you know, we didn't import, like I didn't take like a top-down screen grab to know exactly where those mountain ranges are. I kind of just did like a green square. One thing you can easily do if you're trying to do that is just kind of add in another texture color here really quickly to act as kind of the borders. And this way you can kind of like just see this, just so you can see where the borders are to kind of find out exactly the kind of unit dimensions you need for your landscape. So we can just save this, and then of course you can just undo those little corner pieces, but we can just save this here real quick. Jump back into Unreal. Re-import our texture. And now we have these yellow lines, and they make really nice like little areas to kind of line up the texture quite easily. So now we can take our landscape size and just kind of really adjust the values until we kind of get them to be like right there where we want them. So basically 12,000 is kind of like our unit size for how big this little landscape is. Again, unfortunately, I've never actually figured out a perfect way to kind of know exactly right off the bat what that is, because if I applied it to this terrain, which obviously there is some of this grass already in this environment, you can see that it's there, but it's not filling up this, you know, entire space. So unfortunately, it's just kind of at least a little bit of a guess, but you know, adding in these little edges here works out really well, and then you kind of paint in a lot of these details. But we can see that with the grass here, you know, when we're using that hard brush in in Photoshop, we're getting, a really harsh transition. We're getting this, basically this super crisp line, and it's blending over multiple patches of grass. It's not basically being like, oh, well, one patch of grass is a little bit darker and then the next patch is a little bit darker. I know there is a speed tree node that you can add that'll add some kind of color variation to your grass assets or tree assets. However, the issue with that is it'll make each individual mesh asset a different color. It'll slightly adjust those colors, but you're not going to be able to get either, kind of a nice blend where you're seeing, like, obviously we've got a really harsh line here. We probably wouldn't want that. We probably want something a little bit more subtle where we're getting, this nice kind of like fading of from this blue to this green, because we're using obviously a really nice soft alpha brush here in in Photoshop, but we're getting that, really nice smooth transition from, pure blue all the way out here to kind of, this more light blue, and then all the way out to kind of pure green. So you can get some really awesome, really nice transitions between your different materials or your different textures and everything. So it's kind of one of those great things for kind of a final step, or to add in a bunch of different kind of color, a different kind of variation all throughout your kind of scene. And then of course, once you do have those scale kind of areas kind of figured out, the exact sizing of your landscape, then you can just remove those like kind of yellow lines. Yeah, but it's a really great way to kind of just add in a whole bunch of different color variation. So you can kind of just get a nice feeling for your environment and kind of really break up, especially large scale tiling that you're seeing throughout your environment. If you do want to kind of do this on a large area of grass, maybe a grass field that you have, or even kind of different assets that you might have placed throughout your environment. So let's say you had a whole bunch of boxes or barrels, because those are super common in video games, but you wanted them to, all of them have different colors of paint on them. You didn't want them to all be the exact same one. Well, you could use this technique to kind of basically paint in different areas where you wanted, like, oh, I want like a whole bunch of like red barrels here, maybe a whole bunch of blue barrels there, and a whole bunch of white barrels over there. And that way all the paint on all those barrels could kind of change and adjust exactly where you wanted. And you wouldn't need to kind of make a shader for your white barrels, a shader for your red barrels, a shader for your green barrels. You could just use this one little texture. Now, with this technique, you also don't really have to do kind of a single one-to-one unique map. Obviously I wanted to show this off because it can allow you to really hand paint in areas that you want to add in specific colors, which can be really great and break up a lot of nice variety if you kind of really go in there and paint things. But another thing you can do is just grab this shader here. Instead of saying the scale to be the kind of one-to-one parameters, the kind of the edges of this screen here, and doing like a one-to-one unique map, you could utilize a tiling texture in this spot that adds in just random kind of color variation. And then all you have to do is just change the landscape size to something a lot smaller. So you can imagine if you had kind of like a tiling texture that was just giving you some subtle breakups in kind of like the colors in here. So obviously these colors are super bright, super kind of in your face, but you can imagine if you were slightly tinting some of these areas to be maybe a little bit more kind of brown, maybe a little bit more yellow, maybe a little kind of subtle differences in kind of the greens that you have there. It can kind of really lend itself to kind of breaking up these colors pretty nicely, even in a way that you're utilizing a tiling texture if you don't want to kind of paint a unique one-to-one top down. But it can kind of really add in a lot of nice variation to a lot of these grass assets that you have if you want to use a tiling texture instead. So let's just set this back to 12,000 here. And then of course we do have the landscape blend, which then you can kind of change to kind of remove this essentially this overlay. So if you set it kind of like a default value of 1, this is kind of like the default where it's kind of a nice in between of what your actual texture originally was and then the blend. And then the closer to 0 you get, it's going to be more of showing the texture that's coming through than it will be showing your original grass texture. And then of course, the higher number up you go, it'll pretty much like, start to disappear and fade away. But it just adds a whole lot of nice kind of color variation in there. Ooh, and then negative colors are really terrible, so don't use negative numbers. But it can add in a lot of really nice variation. It's one of those really good ending steps to kind of do to kind of break up, especially if you just have a lot of areas of essentially like grass plains or foliage that's all kind of the same color, and you're like, okay, I'm getting, everything's looking too green, but I don't want to really just have random patches, like a random singular patch of grass be like orange, or dark yellow, dark tan, where it's like dying, and then the patch right next to it is vibrantly green. This kind of gives you that control to really hand paint and handcraft the experience that you want to tell within your scene. So just to kind of wrap everything up here, we will kind of just go over this really quickly again, just in case, as I do know it's a little bit of a confusing one. But basically we have like a 1-to-1 texture sample here. That was our little like smiley face guy. We're grabbing the absolute world position as we need to know where in the world this landscape is to kind of map this shader to it. We're going to be masking out our R and G channels, which correspond to our X and Y channels, as on our landscape here, we want to grab our X and Y values. So we're going to subtract that from the absolute world position, subtract it from our mask. So we have that data. Here is our X and our Y. Again, R and G. RGB corresponds to X, Y, and Z. We're going to want to divide that by our landscape size. As always, as I mentioned, I just kind of always first guess at this number, and then, it's easy to kind of just use this as a scalar parameter to kind of get exactly whatever size you want. It can be 1-to-1 or it can be tiling. And then we just plug those into the UVs. We are going to be blending between our original grass texture and our 1-to-1 map here. So we're going to use our friend linear interpolate. We are going to use just default texture coordinates. This is basically just for the alpha. We're going to just mask out one channel, and then we're going to use a power node to just control how much fall off we want on this with a scalar parameter. You can set the default value to 1 or 0, and then that will be our alpha. And then you can plug that in. And then everything else, obviously, you can just add in all the cool bells and whistles to your grass shader, like wind and all of those kind of cool effects. And that should do it for that. It's a fun little thing. You can add in a lot of nice kind of color variation, especially if you do have any scenes with a wide kind of open kind of field, a nice plane, and you want to kind of get some variation in there. And again, you don't have to use a unique 1-to-1 texture in there. You can just use kind of a tiling texture and kind of just reduce this number. And then you'll get some cool effects in there as well. So, if you're just kind of like a player running around this big and you're seeing some kind of random splotchy patches, that can also work out well. All right, and with that, we'll be pretty much wrapping up week 7. I know it's kind of a small week of just the week 6 and week 7 kind of going over foliage. It's not a ton, but it's, hopefully if there is any other foliage that you are interested in learning about, let me know, and we kind of, of course, cover that in the final weeks to come. We are, of course, getting to the end, so if there are any questions, make sure you guys drop them in the live Q&A forums if you want me to go over them during the live Q&As, or if you have questions that need answers kind of right away, drop them in the forums and I'll try to answer them as best as possible. And we are kind of getting to the end of the class, so even whatever your questions are, if they are related to kind of what you want to see in terms of a demo, what you want to see in terms of, or what you want to know about in terms of environment creation or portfolio creation or pretty much anything related to the industry, don't hesitate to ask those questions. This is kind of obviously the best time to do it. You want to get them in before we run out of time, as this time is for you. And if there are any questions that you are really curious about kind of workflows at studios, workflows at Naughty Dog, just pretty much anything, even if it's just kind of slightly unrelated to the class, I'm always fine with answering those questions and going over things like that if it is something that you will find as valuable information in your career development, as kind of that is obviously the goal of everything. And of course, week 8, we're kind of going to be really kind of discussing how we can really start to compile these scenes, build them up, build out kind of these beautiful environments. Again, think about ways you can start to tell stories in your environment, how you can kind of add those small little character things. Again, they don't have to be really big. As I mentioned, with your points of interest where you're trying to tell the stories, you don't have to have them just be grandiose, big, large temples, big kind of like sci-fi mechs in there to be kind of cool. Telling something, even with a small singular asset, you can tell a kind of really cool and compelling story really easily, as long as you structure your environment around to kind of consult that. Clarence asks, can we consult you through the form outside the usual weekly assignment submission for the next 3 weeks? Like if you have any questions, yeah, of course. And if you're like, hey, what about this? Like, I'm trying to do this, struggling to kind of figure this out. Like Frank was asking about kind of some alpha cards, like there's like alpha cards kind of on the edges of this kind of rusted out truck and truck bed thing. And if that is something that we do, and that is of course something that we do utilize, kind of like alpha cards to kind of build out some of these things. So if you do have questions like that, of course, don't hesitate to kind of ask if you do have any kind of questions related to anything for, just kind of in general on things, as want to make sure we get all those answers as possible. All right. And with that, we will wrap it up. Thanks everyone for coming out. Check out all the cool stuff that is coming out of GDC, and make sure you guys ask those questions if you have them, and don't fall too far behind, as we are kind of in the closing weeks, and a lot of your scenes are looking really great, and really can't wait to see them all kind of finished up with those cool bells and whistles on them. All right, everyone, have a good week.